our librarian. He'll be in and out this evening. I'd like to welcome you to the event. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Kathy Shea, and I'm our city archivist. That's how I got to meet Mark when he was in the process of beginning the research for his really, really wonderful book. By way of introduction, Mark is from Connecticut. After he graduated from college, he and his girlfriend decided to come out here. He says to work, he's also confessed to surf. Over time, of course, he's created and produced this really remarkable book. I encourage you all to read it, and we're looking forward to hearing what he has to say. As a consequence of his love for history of Huntington Beach and surfing of Huntington Beach, he's now working with Keoki Carroll's surfing school, and if I remember, board member surf shop, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And what he's not telling you is that he's also just an incredibly gifted technology guy. You know, websites and the internet and all of that. He's just wonderful. He's also a lot of fun. When he was coming into the archives, I used to just get such a kick out of the stories he had. You know, things like, I was just telling this one to his mom. You know, he would track down the daughter of somebody that long since died, and he knew he really wanted to talk to her. And he'd go all the way down to San Diego or someplace, and they'd like him so much, they'd invite him to stay so he could do more the next day. So that kind of gives you an idea. Personally, in our archives, he would also chip in to help. He pried open one of my jammed file cabinet drawers, put the wheels back on our book cart, and helped me pick out the portable scanner we have today. So I'm going to let him begin. I do want to say, by way of housekeeping, we have a sign-in sheet back here. Please make sure you initial it so we know you were here. We're so thrilled all of you came. We do have coffee, tea, and some munchies back there. Although I got to tell you, the Chips Ahoy have been pillaged. I don't think there's more than maybe 100 bags left. So with that, Mark, take it away.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Thank you guys for all coming out. This is awesome. This is a better than expected turnout. Really stoked to be here. Appreciate Aaron inviting me and the library inviting me. They've been doing these coffee and culture talks for the past couple months. Last month, Kathy did a great one on the Carnegie Libraries, library history in town. They did one previously. Kathy did one as well on the history of this library. They did one on George Freeth. I think this is the last one of 2023, 2022, but they'll be back next year, so I recommend checking those out as well. But I'm thrilled you guys are here. Thank you for coming, whether it's because you're interested in surfing, the history of Huntington Beach, or the history of surfing in Huntington Beach, or because they're giving you free coffee and snacks, whatever the reason why you're here. I'm thrilled you guys are here. The reason I'm here is to talk a little bit about that history, and specifically the early years of history of Huntington Beach. The later years of history of Huntington Beach surfing, 60s onward, especially 70s onward today, are pretty well known. The reason being is because a lot of those people are still around to tell us firsthand accounts. Prior to this, like with so many other things like World War II, Harlem jazz scene, there aren't that many people left, and sadly they're diminishing by the numbers. So I've always been more interested in telling those stories, and they're a little harder to find, but they're a lot more fascinating to me because they explain the roots of how we got to where we are today. And so I'm going to share some of what I found with all of you. Beginning with this photo. So this photo comes around 1909 when Huntington Beach was incorporated as a city. And to my research and my knowledge, this is the first image depicting surfing in our town. They probably surfed before this, but nobody really documented it, but this one is the first one. So like I said, this is around 1909. Behind there is the wooden pier, which was built in 1904. And as different as things are today, they're also not that much different. This could have very easily been down by the beach and the pier today, just a lot less numbers, people still having fun, people enjoying it, and most notably, people surfing. If you see right here, there are people body surfing. And surfing means a lot of things to a lot of people. I'm of the opinion surfing means riding a wave regardless of the situation. So whether you're body surfing, bodyboarding, boogie boarding, stand-up surfing, knee surfing, it all counts. And this does as well. So we've captured some people body surfing, and I'm sure they were body surfing as long as people went in the ocean here. So this isn't anything new, but it's the first photographic evidence of it that we have. But what most people think of when they think of where surfing began in Huntington Beach is 1914. To celebrate this guy right here, the pier, which was built in 1914. That wooden pier we just saw a few years prior got destroyed in a storm. They built this at what at the time was the longest and tallest concrete pier in the country. And to celebrate that event, they held a ceremony. And to just kind of set the scene of this ceremony, which took place in June 1914, this is kind of what it looked like to a degree. This is a postcard from the OC archives showing the Huntington Beach Inn. Huntington Beach around this time was probably around a 2-block radius. Not a lot of people. I think there was around 1,400 people living in the town at that time, but people from outside would come in, and how they'd come in is during the red car. Henry Huntington's red car line would drop them off, they'd get off, spend a day at the beach. And that's what happened June 20th, 1914, albeit with a lot more people. So like I said, there's 1,600 people in town at that time. Well, 1,400, 1,600 people. By the estimates of the newspapers, around 15,000 to 20,000 came out to celebrate the dedication of the pier, just to kind of show you this small little town hosting this big event. Why are we talking about this? Well, we're talking about it because a close-up of the events that happened during that day. We're talking about this, and some of you might know where I'm going with all this. We're talking about 5 words right here that say surfboard riding George Freeth, a little after 2:30 p.m. on June 20th, 1914. And some of you are probably very familiar with George Freeth. He is the documented first surfer in Huntington Beach. A little bit about George. He was a Hawaiian, not a native Hawaiian, but he lived in Hawaii. He came over to California to promote Hawaii and exhibit surfing. He also worked as a lifeguard in Redondo and would travel up and down the coast to demonstrate surfing, promote Henry Huntington's development projects, and on this occasion to celebrate the pier. Just to give you some life to this, I know a few weeks ago, some of you may have come, Patrick Moser was here talking about George Freeth. He actually wrote a book on him. I'm not sure what he talked about, but just to give a little life to this, we're all familiar with this photo, but sometimes it doesn't paint the full picture. This is the only recording I know of George Freeth, so just to kind of see him in life. That's him riding the bike right there. Working as a lifeguard in Redondo Beach. This is actually not him surfing, it's him life-saving. And that's George Freeth over there on screen right. The one that's getting hugged. That's George Freeth. That's
You're probably being a lifeguard, right?
yeah, that was him being a lifeguard. Yeah. So like I said, that's all the video footage I know of him in existence. So there was no video footage of him surfing by the pier. And unfortunately, there are no pictures of him surfing by the pier. But it probably looks something like this. This is George Freeth surfing in Redondo around there. This is his style. If you were sitting on shore, this is probably what you saw. And later on, about a week later, the Huntington Beach News reported on the event as a whole. And this is what they had to say about George's ride. He surfed in front of about 1,000 people, well, several thousand people, on the east side of the pier with the ease and grace of a seagull. Yeah, he is. He's a fantastic surfer, and you can see him there surfing very smooth. It says here he surfed on east side. We might not be familiar with that right away. East side is what they called south side back then. So if you're facing the pier, to your left, that's east side, what we call today south side. Interestingly enough, back then, east side was the worst side to surf on. Not so much because of the waves, but because of the equipment they were riding on. It was less ideal to ride on back then in the 1910s and 1920s. So if you had to take a pick, you'd want to surf west side. But George didn't have the pick, so he ended up doing this exhibition on the lesser of the two sides. But I don't think that got in his way. He stood on his head doing a ride. I don't know if he did it, but he has been known to do a flip on a surfboard while riding a surfboard. So he put on a show. Thing is, surfing didn't take off after this. As exciting as it was for people and maybe impressive to them, they probably saw the show, left, and immediately forgot about surfing for the rest of their lives. They probably looked at it more as akin to a novelty act, something like going to the circus and watching like a sword eater or fire breather, as opposed to something they wanted to do themselves. It wasn't until this guy that it started to take root. And I'm sure many of you know this. If you know Freeth, you definitely know this guy. If you've ever walked by PCH in Maine, you've walked by him about 1,000 times. The statue of him, which is kind of based off this picture from circa 1915 in Waikiki, Duke Kahanamoku. deserving of the name father of modern surfing. Just a little bit about Duke. He was a native Hawaiian, an Olympic swimmer. He won 3 golds and 2 silvers across 3 Olympics. At one point, he was the fastest swimmer in the world and one of the biggest sports celebrities in the world, right up there with Jim Thorpe. So he was well known, and on top of that, he was a waterman. And maybe some of you have seen the recent documentary on him. And he loved surfing. And so when he would do his victory laps around the world celebrating his Olympic achievements, he would surf if he could. One of those places famously was Australia in 1914. He introduced surfing to Australia, and we all know what happened there. And he would later come to California and do the same. Maybe didn't introduce surfing here because some of us had access to Hawaii, so maybe they had seen it before, but he definitely gave root to what I think is the birth of the California surf scene. So in the 1920s, Duke came to Hollywood specifically to become an actor, and he was doing aquatic shows, but in between his acting gigs and his shows, he would find any chance he could to go surfing. And where would he go surfing? He'd go to Newport. He'd go right by Huntington Beach, and he'd go to Corona del Mar because that was one of the best surf breaks in the area. He said it was the closest thing he'd found to Waikiki. Unfortunately, none of us can go and see it anymore because it's been destroyed when they extended the jetties. But in the 1920s, it was there, and it was amazing. And he spent a lot of his time there, and because he was so famous, a lot of people went there as well to hang out with him. And although they went in the water and they surfed and they learned how to surf, they learned how to shape boards from Duke, what really gave birth to this surf scene and this culture was what they did on the sand, because they would hang out. They would listen to Duke tell stories about Hawaii and Hawaiian culture. He'd play the ukulele, he would sing. His friends from Hawaii would come hang out. And although Freeth was surfing and showed people how to surf, it wasn't really a culture around it. It was more, like I said, a novelty act. When Duke was around, it became a community. And this is an example of that community in Corona del Mar. Duke is in here, I'll point him out to you. This is what I like to call the first surf scene, surf spot, maybe surf culture in Southern California, maybe in all of California probably. After this, eventually when they killed off the surf spot, people went to San Onofre for a few years. Then the war happened, they built a base there and they kicked those guys out. They went to Malibu, and then from Malibu it went to the rest of the world. But it kind of all started here with these guys. That's Duke right there. That's Duke. So it just goes to show, like, they were just hanging out, having a good time, and then they'd go surf. A lot of it was redwood back then. Yep. So yeah, the California surf scene origins. But why are we talking about Corona del Mar? Because we're here about Huntington Beach. Well, here's a list that was written by a guy named John Volti from memory of all the people that surfed in Corona del Mar pre-1929. Number 1 there is Duke, number 2 is George Freeth, and who we're interested in is number 11 and number 10, Bud Higgins and Gene Belshie. These 2 guys are Huntington Beach locals who would go down there to hang out, meet the Duke, and learn to surf. Some of you may be familiar with them. If you've been on the pier lately and gotten to the end of the pier, you'll notice that Ruby's is no longer there, and in place of it is a place called Bud and Gene's. This is Bud, and this is Gene. Gene's right here. That's Bud right there, Delbert Bud Higgins. In the middle is Gene's wife, Johnny. To give you an idea of how close these guys were, Gene and Johnny named their kid Bud. So they are a very close-knit group. These guys did a lot. Most importantly, probably, for that time, was they were the first full-time year-round paid lifeguards. Bud went on to become the first lifeguard chief, the first fire chief, and he was a city historian. Gene went on to become an assistant police chief. But for our purposes, they were also the first Huntington Beach surfers and made the very first surfboards in Huntington Beach. Those two boards right there. There's a great interview with with Bud about his time in Huntington Beach and his experiences, including making these boards. And this is kind of him recounting the creation of those two boards. In short, they went down to Newport, they went down to Corona del Mar, they saw Duke's boards, they talked to Duke, got some tips how to make boards, went back, found some wood, chopped it in half with a draw knife and a planer, and then made these two 10-foot boards, varnished them up, and this was the end result. Weighing 135 pounds dry, a lot more wet. Yeah. This is 1927. Yeah. Yep. So that is, with those two guys, where surfing began in Huntington Beach. And it grew from there. So they, in essence, brought surfing to Huntington Beach. Being full-time lifeguards, they didn't really have a lot of free time to surf. So their boards were just sitting around. So they let the kids in the area go out and have a great time on their boards. I don't think this is one of those two boards we just saw. This actually looks like a different one. It's either a modified version of Bud's board, or maybe Bud shaped this board for the kids to enjoy because it's a little shorter. But either way, it was becoming more common to see surfboards and people surfing around the pier. There weren't a lot of them. They weren't doing anything amazing, but they were there. This probably also, to my knowledge, the first Grammy of Huntington Beach, at least documented. I'm sure there were others, but I've also been asked, and people have often wondered, did Duke ever surf along the pier? And as far as we know, the answer is yes. So there's a picture of Duke. That's not him actually surfing here. Unfortunately, there's no images of it. But according to Bud, who I tend to believe, he said that he invited Duke to come and surf the pier at least once, if not multiple times. And he took him up on that offer. They came and they surfed north side, what they called west side, because the surf was just better. And that's where Bud and Gene and most of the people that were surfing were there. And that's where Duke surfed. And this photo is from around that era, so this is probably what it looked like when Duke was paddling out around the pier. This photo below I find interesting because it's just maybe a scenic shot of Northside Huntington Beach. But if you look right there, that's the first lifeguard tower in Huntington Beach. And leaning up against it is a board that looks a lot like Bud's first board. And I always actually like this photo too because the juxtaposition with that board standing upright, that lone board, and then in the backdrop, that army of oil derricks standing upright. And somehow, against all odds, that lone board went on to do bigger and better things in this town than those oil derricks, which are no longer there. But there's a lot more, and there's a bigger army of surfboards out there today. But also interesting about this photo is what's in between those two. It's the saltwater plunge. And that was a community pool, saltwater pool, no waves, that people could go and safely get in the water without having to battle the waves. Johnny Belshi, Gene's wife, would teach swimming there. And through their connections, they allowed Bud and Gene to store their boards overnight because they'd be so wet and so heavy that dragging them around town would be impractical. So they stored them there. So in essence, the saltwater plunge was the first board locker and boardroom of the city. And here's a shot of just kind of promoting surfing. Like, surfing didn't take off. Like, this doesn't mean surfing just blew out of the waters here. But through Bud's efforts especially, it started to become more popular, or at least people were becoming more aware of it. This picture from 1939 in Lake Park was during an event to showcase the sports of Huntington Beach at the time, half of which involved guns. The other half were golfing, bowling, archery, and fly fishing, of all things. And then Bud right there holding what looks to be like a 10 to 12 foot board promoting surfing. And so, like I said, it was starting to slowly grow, and we can start seeing some examples of that here. These aren't surfboards, but they're very close. These are called surf mats. If you see those little black rectangles, or surf bags is what they used to call them there. They were very popular with kids. They're like inflatable little rafts that they would take out and ride kind of like a boogie board. And a lot of kids in the 50s, 60s got their start riding waves on these things. A lot of them stood up on their first waves on these things. Some people might have owned these, but most of these kids probably rented them from this place right here. which was called Dwight's Beach Concession. Started in the late 30s, still kicking it today. But as you can see right there, amongst other things, they were renting out surf bags and surfboards. So if we wanted to trace the history of surfboard rentals back in this town, this would be the first one to do it, of which there are many today. So it was starting to percolate. But again, the Bud, Gene, even Duke, George, they weren't so much defined as surfers because they had so many other things going on. Duke was an Olympic athlete, Bud and Gene were lifeguards, these people loved surfing, but they weren't defined by it. That started to change with the next generation. This guy here is a guy by the name of George Stremple. I'm going to let you hear his story from himself because, again, it's so important to preserve the first-hand accounts. So I'll let him tell how he got started in surfing in Huntington Beach.
I hitchhiked down to Highway 39 and then down to Huntington. And I had a billy board and swim fins. Because there were quite a few surfers. There were probably as many as 6 or 8 guys out there. I met a guy in Huntington Beach named Rocky Freeman who lives there. And he just got out of it. He and I became pals. We started making surfboards out of balsa wood life rafts. I'll tell guys certain events that surfing happened, and I always say, well, we didn't know we were making history, you know.
That's a great last line. This is actually a part of clip from an hour documentary with George talking about his life surfing and living in this area. It's free.
Hard to go off the lip.
He's commenting on him surfing on that last wave. Check it out if you want. It's free on YouTube. There was a name mentioned in there, Rocky Freeman, who is... So George didn't live in town. He actually, like he was saying, he would travel into town. He lived up north inland. He came here to hang out with a guy named Rocky Freeman, who was, for all intents and purposes of our talk here today, I'm going to say the original surf rat of HB. So a surf rat is someone who just lives surfing. So like I said, Bud and Gene surf, but I don't know if you'd call them hardcore surfers. And what we would think as a hardcore surfer today was a surf rat back then, someone who lived, breathed, ate, slept surfing. Rocky Freeman was one of the originators of that. And he was a character. He kind of ended up being a ringleader for the kids in the area and some of them outside and starting a youth surf scene, the first surf scene in Huntington Beach. There he is surfing right there. He actually lived right over here on 6th Street. Across the street from him lived Gene Belshie. Gene sold Rocky his first board for $12, this massive board that it would take 3 of them to lug it down to the beach and then 3 of them to lug it back the day after. But Rocky was hooked and he started shaping boards in his mom's garage at the house over here on 6th Street. I wouldn't say it was the first surf shop in town, but he created a sign and put it up over the garage door, called it Rock's Surf Shop. And before you saw that picture of George Stremple, that was in front of that garage, he would come, they would shape boards there. If you want to see that home tonight, unfortunately you can't, but when you walk out of here, take a look down the road, you're going to see a big building that's wood framed, and that's currently being built where Rocky's home was. About 6 months ago, they tore down the home. It was this nice 1617 cottage. With up to a year ago, if you wanted to go see where some of the first surfboards were shaped and where one of the surfing pioneers lived and hung out, you could have. Unfortunately, you can't anymore, but at least you'd be able to see kind of where it was and give you an idea of him. But like I said, those boards were really heavy, and thanks to Bud Higgins, who saw that there was this kind of growing surf scene of youngsters around. Decided to throw them a bone and said, hey, why don't you guys keep your boards underneath the pier? And you don't have to lug them back and forth all the time. So there's a room being unused over there, and he let them set up a official boardroom, and they actually called it the boardroom affectionately. And there was enough room in there to hang out, and so they made it into a clubhouse. So that, in essence, became the first surf club in Huntington Beach, called the Keoki Boardroom. Keoki is named after Rocky Freeman's dog, right there. That is, and in turn, Keoki the surf dog was named after George Stremple, the guy we just heard from earlier, Keoki is Hawaiian for George. So Rocky named his dog after George, and they named the surf club after the dog. That's actually a photo of Rocky and George surfing right there. Those are some of the names of the first iteration of this surf club, the Keoki Club. In the area, some of those names you might recognize. Frank Sorelli was very active in town. Harlow Labard was, I don't know, maybe some of you even got taught how to drive from Harlow. A lot of these people were hanging around here. I'll give you an idea, though, of this scene. And now there were more members of this club, but this is a good photo because it just kind of shows you how small it was. Huntington Beach was not an attraction for surfing. It wasn't on anyone's radar. But there was this small, growing, tight-knit group of people forming a community here. By comparison, here's around that same time the surf scene in San Onofre, the mecca of surfing at the time. That was on most people's radar, but still, it was more localized. At this time and at this point, the surf scenes were more niche and localized to the towns they were taking place in, the cities they were taking place in. People didn't really cross-pollinate yet. And that was going to change very shortly for a few reasons that we'll talk about, but just to give you an idea of where we stood compared to everybody else. That changed in the next decade with these guys and several others not included in this photo. Some of these guys consider them this next generation of the Keoki Club, and others just considered them as part of a local surf scene. They didn't really know much about the Keoki Club, but they all came together at the pier and started building up a more tight-knit and stronger surf community. These guys are known affectionately around here as the Boys of 55. This photo was taken in 1955, and not too long ago, this group of people listed down here were inducted into the Surfing Walk of Fame. And that was even less so to pay tribute to this surf club and more to just all these people, these names and even beyond, that helped originate surfing as we kind of know it. And that is, yeah, exactly. And that is, there's only 7 of these guys left. And that's why we're telling this story. I mean, these are the guys who originated. And when we think of surfing, this is it. One of them I'm going to let you hear from in a moment right here. But I just wanted to point out a few of them. This guy right here holding his arms out, that's Pete Siracusa. He actually got his first board from Rocky Freeman and Harlow Labard, and they also showed him how to make his first surfboard. He actually owned the Chart House, some of you may remember, and started the very popular restaurant chain, the Rusty Pelican, later on. This guy right here, his name is Blackie August. He was father of Robert August, which some of you may have heard of, who starred in The Endless Summer. Blackie was a key figure, mentor in this scene. He's from Surfside, and he basically was a father figure. Great surfer, surfed with Duke, but also would become kind of a father figure and like leading figure in this scene. And one other guy we're going to hear from right now, right here, wearing that St. Christopher medal, is a guy by the name of Chuck Winnan. And let's hear how he got started.
I was the second group of fraternal brothers for the Keoki Club, for the Boys of 55. Rocky Freeman and George Truppel and the little garage below the pier called the Keoki Club. All the former veterans of the world of surfing were there. On the Huntington Beach pier, they used to hang a big line with a boat bag on it. My first year surfing there, I paddle out, I see Jack over there, and Les waving all the way. They're taking sips of hot wine. One guy had some donuts there. They're having fun. We're trying to, they're cold. We paddle over, and then Les said, they're not in the Keoki Club. I need to get in. He told me a story, I like his story, I invited him over. So they gave me a sip of the wine on the boat of that really warm, buying the donut. Now we'll ride some waves, Chuck. That's how they brought you in.
That's Chuck surfing right there. Some of you may have put 2 and 2 together. Chuck is actually sitting right here with us this evening. Yep, deservedly so, and I'll talk a little bit about Chuck, and I'll talk a little bit more at the end, but just to give you an idea of who he was and why we're talking about him here is Chuck has been a leading figure in the surf scene here for decades and still is. But he started here, the Boys of 55, the Keoki Club. That's where he got his start. Phenomenal surfer, ended up being a pioneer in the North Shore with the big waves. So whenever you see big waves and big wave surfers like Greg Nolan and all that stuff, Chuck was right there doing it with them, helping them lead the way. He is also, these Boys of 55, awesome surfers, awesome to remember. They were a rough and tumble group. Not the most welcoming group, not the easiest to go out there, especially if you're new. It was kind of hard to paddle out and instantly be welcomed. But a big exception to that was Chuck, who was always there to help and mentor everybody, teach them, especially if you're new. He'd show you what not to do, what to do, how to stay safe. And so it was that kind of effort and teaching, which he went on to become a teacher, that really set the scene. To talk about Chuck's motto and just the type of person he is, life's like high tide, low tide, kind of sums him up. This photo, actually, interestingly enough, Kathy, you found this photo in the archives of Chuck, maybe unknowingly at the time, but this has actually become a kind of popular photo around town. And that's Chuck surfing right there by the pier. And we'll talk a little bit more about Chuck in a little bit. I'm going to take a little interlude here because we just saw the pier. The pier is a big player in our story. I'm going to show you a clip of someone surfing the pier in Hollywood's eyes. Some of you may remember a show called Route 66 about a guy who would just travel around the country. I don't know if he always stayed on Route 66, and this time he didn't. He came to Huntington Beach, and there was an episode there where the entire episode revolved around the perils of shooting the pier and overcoming that fear. Shooting the pier, for those of you who might not know, is when you go between the pylons and go underneath the pier. And it's some good footage of around this time. It gives a kind of an atmosphere of it. A little corny, Hollywood style, but let's see what it looks like. I know that happened. I don't know what he did there at the end. I guess he's throwing his board to the pier gods, sacrificing his board to the pier gods. I don't know. He overcame his challenge of the pier. Anyway, shows you what the pier looked like there. Someone else I want to talk about from the Boys of 55 who played a big role in Huntington Beach surfing, actually from Seal Beach. This guy right here, Jack Haley. Some of you might know him better as Captain Jack. Maybe you've passed by his restaurant. Maybe you've eaten there before. It's not too far from here. He was a big figure for a few reasons, one of which being he was the first major surf champion in town in the 1959 West Coast Surfboard Championships, which eventually became the OP Pro, which eventually became the US Open, which is still held here every year in the summer. He was the one who won the first one. He won that contest by going through the pier, shooting the pier, turning around, and then unshooting the pier and doing it a second time and coming back through. So to show you a little bit of what real deal pier shooting looks like, here's him. So that's Jack. The second big thing he did in town was he helped kickstart the first surf shop in town. This place called Surfboards by Gordy. Gordy Duane, originally from Compton, was surfing around that time, 1955 and 1956. He's right there next to Pete Siracusa and Lord Murray. In 1956, he wanted to start a surf shop. He was a master craftsman in the Navy. He was a craftsman, and he loved shaping boards. He learned how to do it while in Hawaii. And when he came over here, he wanted to continue it and set up a shop. Jack Haley had some friends at some concessionaires in the beach and was able to get Gordy 4 rooms, 4 garages for a total of $10 a month by the pier, and they opened up Surfboards by Gordy, which we're going to see that shop in a second. First, we're going to hear from somebody else from this time. This guy's name is Harold Walker. He was one of the leading innovators of surfboard blanks, and he would make the foam that would be used for shaping surfboards. And he was also one of the boys of 55. He would surf at the pier. Here he's going to talk about Gordy. Gordy, there were a lot of guys that were rough around the edges. Gordy might have been the roughest. He was a character from what I've heard. I've never met him, but you can kind of get a flavor of it from Harold here.
So my first customer was Gordy. Remember Gordy Surfboards? Crazy Gordy. And Gordy got in a fight. Remember this? He got in a fight and broke his fist, so he couldn't hold his planer. So here's my only customer with broken hands. So I said, couldn't rough shape the board. So I said, okay, I'll shape it for you. So I'd make blanks during the day, and then I'd go down there at night, and I would rough shape and make 10 blanks, and he could finish them. I was staying with my folks at the time, and they lived in Costa Mesa. It had an old barn on it, and the old barn had a chicken coop in it, and I was making blanks in there. And we had a little hand mixer. That's the drill, the drill blows out air, right? Well, it'd blow out air, and it would shake loose some chicken feathers. So the chicken feathers would flop down. When I mix it, they'd be floating down in the air, and every so often one would flow into the foam, right? Then the Gordy would get the blank, and he'd start shaping the blank, and he'd come across chicken feathers.
The early days of surfboard shaping. And this is where the first surf shop in Huntington Beach was located. It opened up in 1956. It was located right there, right next to the plunge, the stairwells, and then there were 4 rooms there. And it looked like this. This is Surfboards by Gordy in that time. This is actually a clip from an underground surf film, a legendary surf film that not many people have seen or ever heard about. Gordy Duane made a surf film called Sacrifice for Surf. And this is a clip from it. He shot it around the pier around this time, where there's not much footage of that stuff. His surf film is one of the few exceptions. You might notice that surfboards is spelled wrong in that sign. The story behind that is Gordy.
If you look up on the surfboards, it's S-U-R-F-B-O-A-R, then let the A out before the R.
There it is. It's spelled wrong. It is spelled wrong because Gordy hired a man by the name of Don Treese, who was the art director at Knott's Berry Farm. He was a friend of Gordy's, to build this sign and make a sign for him, which Treese did. He delivered the sign. They were looking at it, and Gordy said, hey, you spelled it wrong. That's not how you spell surfboards. And Treese said, oh man, what are we going to do? I didn't realize. And Gordy was thinking about it. He says, you know what? They're surfers, not spellers. It works. So it worked. And that's how we got that. So yeah, the first surf shop in Huntington Beach. And then a few more followed. So this is a big reason why I talked about we had this little niche independent surf scenes happening all over Southern California. They started to converge for a few reasons. Surf spots started to go out. Like in Long Beach, there was a great surf spot that got destroyed by the breakwater. So all those surfers came down here. Huntington Beach is just really accessible because of PCH, or the road that was built there prior. But another big reason, maybe the biggest reason, is because of surf shops. Places like Velzy or Holby's were starting to come about, and people started to travel to get more prestigious boards. And Huntington Beach was at the nexus of all these places because you kind of passed back and forth. And so it became a meeting point for all these surf communities to start to merge. And it started to grow. The scene started to grow. And we got more surf shops. This one's right here is the second surf shop, 1957. That's Jack's Surfboards, still down there, kicking it. Jack's is notable because they kind of kicked surf shop industry into gear. His son was surfing, and he saw a need for surf shops to sell more than just boards and a few shirts, which most of them did at the time. And he started to sell other things as well. I don't know if this is true or not, but I've heard that they were the first people to package commercialize and sell surfboard wax out of anywhere. I've never been able to back that up, but it's one of the urban myths around it. At the opposite end of the spectrum, very low key, you had Bill Holden's surf shop over on Beach. A small shop. There's actually some, I've never been able to confirm this one way or the other, that said this might have actually been started before Gordy's, but Gordy's was more prominent. Gordy was a more prominent figure. I don't know if Bill was maybe officially started a surf shop or anything like that. So it's safe to say that Gordy's is the first surf shop, and these guys are the two that came next. And these guys inspired the next generation in the 60s and beyond, one of whom we're going to hear from right here. Some of you may recognize this guy. This is Bob the Greek Bolin. He became a surfer in town, currently works at HB Realty. If you ever have a chance to stop by there, it's a surf museum unlike any other. You get to go meet Bob in person. He'll love to tell you all about this stuff. But here, we're going to hear about how he got his start in surfing.
I bought a board from Bill Holden. Bill Holden had a shop up on Highway 39 behind his mom's house in Huntington Beach or Midway City or somewhere along there. So I went in, I talked to those guys about a board, and they sold me the very first one. I think it cost about 80 or 85 bucks. It had red rails, and had the red had kind of blotched up a little bit, the red tint, and they gave me a deal on it, supposedly. And I sort of loved that board. Great board. I had one of Bill Holden's white fiberglass fins. He was kind of known for that, and surfed that for a few years. And decided I wanted to just build a surfboard. And I had never worked in a surf shop. I had never hung out around a surf shop. I'd never watched anybody shape a surfboard, but I was going to build a surfboard. Bound determined to go do it. So I went back down to Bill and I go, hey, can I buy a blank from you? He goes, we want a blank for you. I want to build a surfboard. He goes, well, I don't know. I don't want to sell you a blank. What if you go into the business? I go, nah, I'm not going to go into the business. I want to build me a surfboard. So he sold me a blank. Bill liked it, but he sold me a blank.
And the punchline there, which some of you may know, is that he did go into the business, and he started one of the most successful surf shops around, Surfboards by the Greek. These two clips, this one of Greek and Harold Walker above, come from an excellent documentary called Boardroom. I think you can get it on Amazon. If not, you can go to their site and find it. And a lot of these videos are around actually maybe 40 minutes to an hour long. They interviewed all these surf shapers. Surfboard shapers, and it's a great way from here and all other towns. These two came from clips from Harold Walker's and the Greeks interviews. Highly recommended. But it's also a good transition. The Greek is a good transition because, like I said, he is the next generation, and this is kind of where our story kind of comes to an end, because now there's a shift from the early days of surfing in Huntington Beach, what I kind of call like the local surf boom or the local surf scene, to post-1959, which is the mainstream surf boom, or like the mainstream surf scene. And there are three things that, there's more than three things, but if we're going to narrow it down to three things that really caused this shift in Huntington Beach and around the world. First one being surfboards by Gordy burned to the ground. The one by the pier caught fire and was destroyed. Gordy was away at the time. He called his guys because they had a big shipment of boards going out the next day, and he called his guys to say, hey guys, are the boards done? And they replied, yeah, they're done. They're very well done. And that was the end of Gordy's, which is kind of symbolic. It's symbolic of the end of an era around the pier in that Boys of 55 photo, and it's symbolic of the transition that would go into bigger and more financially driven surf shops. Second thing that happened, we already talked about, 1959, West Coast Surfboard Championships. That is a picture from the event. You can see how popular it is. Probably the most people that have come to witness surfing, either intentionally or unintentionally, at the pier since George Freeth had surfed there way back in 1914, and it only got bigger ever since. And this didn't immediately have a huge impact, but this is also symbolic of the growing competitive scene in surfing, which there was competition and there was contests prior to this, but it wasn't anywhere close to what it is today. And this is kind of a transition point for it. Like, this would go into the US Surfboard Championships, which would turn into OP Pro, which I'm sure many of you know that was a scene, and then would turn into the US Open, which is an event all unto itself. Third thing that happened, not just affecting Huntington Beach, was this movie got released. People people say this all the time, Gidget comes up all the time, but there's for good reason, because it came out in 1959, and once it did, surfing blew up. And much to the chagrin of these original surfers who kind of were on the fringes, surfing was theirs, nobody else cared about it the way they did. There's this tight-knit community. Once Gidget came out, that kind of got taken away from them to a degree. And so kids in Idaho who'd never seen the ocean or even a surfboard were dressing like surfers, acting like surfers, and saying they were surfers. And they kind of took that whole thing that these guys, this special thing that they had, and turned it into something else, which eventually gave rise to the surfboard revolution and stuff like that. A bunch of things gave rise to the surfboard revolution, but it was kind of to distance themselves from the scene that kind of got appropriated. And so these three things kind of started that shift from what we've been talking about to, I don't want to say the modern times, because the 60s were certainly more akin to the boys of 55 than today, but you could see it going in that direction. And the summer came out, popularized surfing around the country even more. Then the shortboard revolution came out and started competitive surfing, and then that turned it into an industry on par with any other athletic sport today. And it's an Olympic sport today. And there's pros and cons to this. It's not to say one way or the other this is bad. Progress, for the most part, is probably good, certainly in this case, but there's always issues with it going one way or the other. Gidget was about a girl surfing in the Malibu surf scene. You'll notice there's one thing that I've kind of left out of this entire talk. Not intentionally, but glaringly, are women surfers. We haven't seen any. That's because there weren't that many. There weren't that many for the history of surfing in general, but there certainly weren't that many pre-1959. At least not that I know of in Huntington Beach. There were a few surfing around the pier around this time, 1959, 1958, 57, but I haven't seen too many photos of it. They might exist. I'm not sure if they do. I'd love to see some if anybody knows about them. But this photo right here is from 1959, so we know they were surfing there because they competed at the 1959 Surfboard Championships. And I'm sure there's photos of them actually surfing. Right there, that's Jack Haley, who came in first. Marge Calhoun, who came in third. Gunrin Wilk, who came in second. Yep. And that's Linda Benson, right there, who came in first. Marge Calhoun became a matriarch of surfing, her entire family, like fantastic surfers. I don't know much about Gunnar Wilk. Linda Benson became kind of the face of surfing, or female surfing, women's surfing, during the 60s. She was an excellent surfer. And there's a great book that just came out, maybe some of you have heard of it, Women on Waves. We have it actually in the library system. There's a copy at the Central Library. It's basically a tome on the history of women's surfing. I highly recommend it. From beginning to present, it just covers all of this. And it's important because that history was there, and they did play an important role, certainly after this, but hopefully before this, we just don't know as much. But those three things, and several other things along with those, created the shift. This is early 1960s, Huntington Beach, during one of the surf contests, and compare that today. Same shot, this is it today. This is what we kind of refer to today as the Times Square of surfing, because surfing has blown up. And like I said before, very localized, very central to the city, and then here it's just central to everybody. So that's much to the credit of those pioneers. They brought those people in. So it's almost a catch-22. Like everybody kind of came onto surfing, but that's just because those guys made it look so cool and so awesome. And they did it with such style and such grace. So it's no surprise that it caught on. But it's always important to remember where it started. And here's a little clip, I think that captures kind of the vibe of those guys. Both competitive surfing, but also just free surfing, having a good time. So yeah, I'm going to wrap this up in a second because that kind of brings us to 1959. So we started in 1914 to 1959. Just one thing I wanted to end on, because like I mentioned before, I think it's so important to preserve the memories. If not the first-hand accounts, then at least create second-hand and third-hand accounts of this. That's why I wanted to share it with everyone here today. I had the privilege of meeting a lot of the guys from this generation and other generations of surfing, which is kind of why I did this and kind of why I love history of surfing. I just love surfing itself, but I love the culture of it, and I love learning about people's stories. I wrote a book about all this. If you guys are interested about it, you can learn more about it. Not to peddle myself. Not really comfortable doing that. But if you're interested in learning more about it, you can, or you can get it from the library. There's a copy here, copy at the Central Library. Somebody I do want to talk about, who we did see in the video and I've already introduced, who came here tonight, was one of those first-hand accounts, and one of the best first-hand accounts you can hear. It's very fitting when you heard Chuck Linden's story earlier about he got inducted into this surf scene by telling a story, because that's what he does better than anyone. He tells stories. And he actually wrote a book, and he's here today with his book. If you guys are ever interested about these first-hand accounts, he wrote his own book talking about his life surfing in Huntington Beach, growing up here, surfing the big waves of Hawaii, that I highly recommend, or even just coming saying hello, because it's pretty cool to be able to talk to someone about these times. So that's what I have for you. Thank you for having me, guys. Thank you. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to talk either here or around.
I'm sure we got a question.
Yeah, so happy to answer them. If not, come on up, say hello.